The morning the noon train brought Adele and Shaw to Cade's Crossing. I had come to town for barbed wire and nothing else, and I would have told you plainly that I had no business standing on that platform at all. I remember I had my hat pushed back and my thumbs hooked in my belt, waiting on the freight car to be worked loose, when the passenger cars hissed and settled, and the whole town seemed to lean in at once. There was a crowd on the depot boards that day, more than a train ought to draw, and I knew why before I let myself think it. Word had gone around all week that Harlan Pike, who kept the mercantile and thought a good deal of himself for it, had sent back east for a wife. A mail-order bride, folks were saying, like she was a bolt of calico he'd ordered off a page. Pike had stood there all morning in a boiled collar with his hair oiled flat, telling anyone who'd listened that she was a young widow of good family, and I'd watched him say it twice with my own eyes and thought, there is a man in love with the sound of his own voice. Then the door of the second car opened, and she came down the steps. She was not young the way Pike had promised, and she was not the picture he'd been painting all morning. She was a woman of maybe 30, plain dressed in gray traveling clothes gone soft at the elbows, with a face that had known weather and grief and had made its peace with both. She carried one trunk that a porter set down, and a carpet bag she would not let anyone else touch, and she stood there on the platform with her chin level, and her eyes going over that crowd looking for the man who'd sent for her. I watched Harlan Pike's face do the arithmetic. I watched him decide. "That's not her," he said loud to the men beside him. "That's not the one. I sent for a girl." She heard it. Everybody heard it. You could see the words land on her the way a slap lands, but she didn't flinch the way you'd expect. She set that carpetbag down easy at her feet and she looked straight at him, and she said, in a plain, steady voice that carried further than his had, "You are Mr. Pike." "I don't know you," Pike said. He'd gone red to the ears. "There's been a mistake. You're older than the letters said. You're—" and here he made a gesture with his hand, a little downward flick, taking in all of her, the gray dress and the tired eyes and the years, and the crowd tittered because a crowd will always titter, and I felt something in my chest go hard and cold as a horseshoe left out in January. "The letters," she said the truth. 30 years old, widowed, no children living. If you had wanted a girl, sir, you should have written for one. I answered honest. But he wasn't going to be shamed in front of his town, and a small man never is. He turned his back on her. He actually turned his back, and he told the men around him something I didn't catch, and one of them laughed the ugly kind of laugh, and Pike walked off up the street toward his store like a man who'd successfully returned spoiled goods. And she was left standing there. I want you to understand what a thing that is. A woman comes near 2,000 miles on the strength of a stranger's word, sells whatever she had most like to buy the fare, steps off into a country she has never seen, among people she has never met, and the one soul on earth she was told would receive her turns his back and walks off, and 30 strangers watch him do it. I have seen men shot, and I have seen men hanged, and I have seen a house burn with everything a family owned inside it. And I am telling you that the cruelest thing I ever saw on that platform was Harlan Pike's back going up the street while that woman stood alone with her one trunk. The crowd started to break up, the way a crowd does, half of them grinning about it, and I heard a woman by the ticket window say, not even quiet, "Well, the bride nobody wanted," and heard another one laugh behind her hand. And Adeline Shaw stood there and let it wash over her, and did not cry, and did not beg, and that steadiness was the first thing I ever loved about her, though I did not know it yet. I had no plan when I crossed that platform. I want to be honest about that, because I have heard the story told back to me over the years like I was some knight riding to the rescue, and it wasn't like that. I had lost my own wife 4 years before. I had lost Marion in the space of a bad week, a fever that came up out of nowhere and took her before the doctor could get out from town. And after that, I had shut the ranch house up tight around my grief, and I had stopped coming to town for anything a man didn't strictly need. I hadn't been to a dance or a supper or a Sunday visit in 4 years. Folks in Cades Crossing had mostly given up on me. I was the Barrett place out on the San Rudo, 30 miles of good grass and one silent widower and his foreman and a handful of hands, and that suited me. So I had no business speaking to a strange woman on a platform. But I found I could not stand there and watch that crowd have its fun, and my feet took me over before my head had anything to say about it. "Ma'am," I said and took my hat off, which felt strange because I hadn't taken my hat off to a woman in 4 years. That was ill done, what he did. I want you to know the whole town don't think the way that man thinks. She looked at me. She had gray eyes, I'd see later, but in the noon light they looked near the color of rain on slate. She looked at me and she measured me the way she'd measured Pike, and I stood still and let her. "You're kind to say so," she said, "but some of them laughed." "Some of them did," I allowed. There was no use lying to her. I could see she'd had a bellyful of men lying to her. But not all, and the ones that laughed are the ones whose opinion isn't worth the dust it settles on. Something in her mouth eased just barely. Not a smile, the neighbor of a smile. "I don't know your town's manners," she said. "I only know I'm 2,000 miles from where I started, with $4.30 and no place tonight." "There's a boarding house," I said. "Widow Dell's, clean and decent, and she keeps a straight table. It's $1 the week for a room and board, and I stopped, because I'd been about to say I'll stand for it, and I could see how that would sound. To a woman just turned away like a parcel, a strange man offering to pay her keep is one more man deciding what she's worth. I've never been quick, but I saw that much. "I'll not take charity," she said, right on top of my thought, quiet and level. "No," I said, "I wouldn't ask you to." And then, because it was harvest and I was short 2 hands and it was the truth, but I've got a cook out at my place gone lame with the rheumatism and 40 men to feed through the branding and the fall gather, and I can't spare a soul to help her. It's honest work and it pays honest wages. Widow Dell's is $1 the week. The waged cover your room and leave you money over to send home or save toward wherever you mean to go, if you want it. I watched her decide whether to believe me. I have thought a great deal over the years about that moment on the platform, about the great gulf a person has to cross to trust a stranger's word when the last stranger's word had left them stranded. She had every reason in the world to tell me to go to the devil. Instead, she picked up her carpetbag and she said, "What's your name?" "Jonah Barrett," I said. "I run the Barrett place out west along the river. Ask anyone in this town about me, and they'll tell you I'm a hard man and a fair one, and both are true." "Adeline Shaw," she said, and she put out her hand to shake, the way a man would, which took me aback, and I shook it, and her grip was firm and dry and sure. "I'll want the wages set out plain, Mr. Barrett. What I do and what I'm paid, and that I'm free to leave when I've earned my way. I've had my fill of arrangements that turned out to mean something other than what was said." "Set out plain," I agreed, "and in writing if you want it." "I want it," she said. So that is how it began. Not a rescue. A job of work in a room at Widow Dell's and a page of terms I wrote out that same afternoon at the feed store's counter in my bad hand, that she read twice through and then signed with a hand a good deal finer than mine. I have that page still. It is in the family Bible now, pressed flat, and my grandchildren think it is the great romance of it, and I let them think so, but the truth is plainer and I think better. The truth is that the first thing that ever passed between Adeline and me was an honest agreement, fairly made, and everything else in 50 years grew up out of that root. I drove her out to Widow Dell's in the buckboard and carried her trunk up myself, and Widow Dell, who had a soft heart under a starched front, took one look at the situation and clucked and fussed, and had the girl fed and settled inside the hour. And I drove back out to the ranch alone in the falling dark, and I remember I was angry all the way home, angrier than the thing rightly called for, and it took me a good stretch of that road to understand it was Pike I was angry at, and past Pike, the whole way of things that let a man like Pike stand on a platform and decide a good woman was worth less than the freight in the next car. I did not know yet that she'd been decided wrong about her whole life. I would learn it slow, the way you learn anything worth knowing. She came out to the ranch the next morning at first light, riding double behind Widow Dell's hired boy, and she had her sleeves rolled before she was off the horse. My cook, Effie, who had run my kitchen since before Marion died and had a tongue on her that could take the hide off a mule, took one look at Adeline and got ready to dislike her, because Effie disliked all newcomers on principle and disliked pretty ones and plain ones equally. And Adeline walked into that hot kitchen with the biscuits already burning and 40 men's dinner nowhere near ready, and she did not say a word about how it ought to be done. She rolled up her sleeves and she asked Effie, "Where do you keep your lard, and how do you like your cornbread, sweet or plain?" And Effie, who had braced for a fight, found she didn't have one and told her plain, and by noon there was cornbread on the table sweet the way Effie liked it, and a stew that stretched to feed the whole crew and even a little over. I ate at the big table that noon, which I didn't always, and I watched her work. She never stopped moving and she never seemed hurried. She had a way of doing 3 things at once and making each one look easy. And when Reuben Cortez, my foreman, came and laid off the North Range with his hand wrapped in a rag where a green colt had opened it on a nail, she set down her ladle and unwrapped it before he could tell her not to fuss, and she looked at it close, and she said, "This wants cleaning and it wants stitching, Mr. Cortez, and if it goes untended you'll lose the use of 2 of these fingers. I can do both if you'll let me. I've done it before." Reuben, who was proud, looked at me. I nodded, and she cleaned that hand and stitched it neat as a seamstress with a needle she boiled first in the coffee water, and Reuben never lost the use of a finger, and he told me later that evening, low in Spanish, that the Señora had a healer's hands and I would be a fool to let her go back east. I told him she wasn't mine to keep or let go, that she was free to leave when she'd earned her passage, and Reuben looked at me a long moment and said, "She, patron." In the particular way he had that meant he thought I was being slow about something. He was right. I was being slow, but I had reasons and Marion was the biggest of them, and grief makes a man careful the way a burned child is careful of the stove. The days went on into the branding, and the branding is hard, long days, and Adeline held up the kitchen through all of it. She earned her wage and then some. She kept the men's clothes mended and their bunkhouse decent and their bellies full, and she doctored the cuts and the burns, and the one bad break when a hand named Willie Pace got a leg under a falling calf, and she set that leg so square that Willie walked without a limp for the rest of his life. And I found, without ever deciding to, that I was eating at the big table every noon and most suppers, where before I had taken my meals alone in the house like a man doing penance. And I found I was talking. I hadn't talked in 4 years, not real talk. I'd given orders and I'd said good morning and I'd sat through the necessary conversations of running a place, but I hadn't talked. And I started talking to Adeline over the scrape of my plate about small things and then not small things. About the range and the weather, and then about the drought 2 years back and how near it had run me under. And one evening, without meaning to, about Marion. "She'd have liked you," I said, and then heard myself say it and put my coffee down, surprised at my own self. Adeline didn't make it awkward the way most people did when I mentioned her. Most people got a soft, pitying look and changed the subject fast, and I hated it, that look. It was a kind of shoving my grief off in a corner so it wouldn't bother the company. Adeline just went on drying the cup in her hands and said, "Tell me about her." So I did. I told her about Marion, my wife, who had come out from Tennessee as a girl and hated the country for a year and then loved it the rest of her life. Who could gentle a horse nobody else could touch, and who sang off-key on purpose to make me laugh, and who died of a fever in 3 days in the spring of a year I would not name because I couldn't say the number without my throat closing. I told her more than I'd told anyone, and Adeline listened the way she did everything, plain and steady and without flinching, and when I was done she said, "You loved her well, a man can tell listening. You loved her all the way to the bone." "I did," I said. "Then she was a lucky woman," Adeline said, "however short it was. My husband didn't love me all the way to the bone or anywhere near it, and I'll tell you it's a colder thing to be buried next to a man's indifference than to grieve a man's love. You've got the better sorrow, Mr. Barrett, if it's any comfort, and I think it is a little. It ought to be." I had never thought of it that way, that there was a better and a worse sorrow, and that mine, for all it had near broken me, was the better kind. It sat with me a long while. "What happened to him?" I asked. "Your husband?" "Consumption," she said. 3 years of it. I nursed him every day of those 3 years, and I'll not pretend I loved him at the end of it, because I didn't. He'd killed that in me with his temper and his contempt long before the lungs got him. But I nursed him faithful because it was mine to do, and I buried him decent, and then I found he'd left me nothing but debts, having drunk and gambled the rest, and his family blamed me for it as if I'd caught the consumption on purpose to spite them. So when the advertisement came, a merchant in Texas, a widower, seeking a wife of good character, I thought, well, it can't be worse than what I have. I'll go where nobody knows me, and I'll keep an honest house for an honest man, and I'll be of use to somebody. That's all I wanted, to be of use to somebody and to be treated fair." "And instead you got Pike," I said. "And instead I got Pike," she agreed, turning me back like a barrel of spoiled flour in front of a whole town. She set the dry cup on the shelf. "But I'll tell you, Mr. Barrett, I've been more use in your kitchen this month than I was in that man's grand plans for me, and I've been treated fairer by you and your Effie and your Mr. Cortez than by any soul in 10 years. So the joke is on Harlan Pike, the way I see it. He sent away the best cook and the best nurse this county's likely to get, and he'll never know it." She said it wry, half a joke, and I laughed, and it startled me, the sound of it, because I hadn't laughed at my own table since Marion. Now I have to tell you about Harlan Pike and his scales, because the two things run together, and you can't have the one without the other. Pike kept the only mercantile in Cade's Crossing, which meant he kept the only store where a rancher could weigh his wool or his hides for sale, and buy his flour and his coffee and his nails and his cartridges. A country like ours ran on trust and on weights, and the man who held the scales held a kind of power over everybody, and a decent man wouldn't abuse it, and Harlan Pike was not a decent man. Folks had grumbled for years that Pike's scales cheated, that his wool weighed light when you sold and his flour weighed heavy when you bought, and that the difference all ran one direction, into Harlan Pike's pocket. But grumbling is one thing and proving is another, and nobody had ever caught him, because Pike kept his own scales and his own books, and a man had to take his word or go without, there being no other store within 40 miles. So the grumbling stayed grumbling, and Pike got a little richer every season on the shaved edge of every honest man's labor, and everybody knew it and nobody could touch it. I hadn't thought much on it personally, because I ran a big enough place that I hauled my wool clear to the railhead at Marfax and sold it there off a scale I trusted. But the small holders couldn't afford the haul. The Yocums and the Devereaux and old Micah Stone and the whole raft of little families scratching a living out of the hill country. They had to sell to Pike or not sell at all, and Pike knew it, and Pike used it. It was Adeline who caught him. I want that plain in the record because the story gets told sometimes like I caught him, or like the men of the county caught him, and that's not the truth. It was Adeline Shaw, with a ledger and a set of test weights and a mind sharper than any blade in my kitchen, and I'll tell you exactly how. She'd taken to keeping my ranch books. That came about natural. She found my accounts one evening in a state that would have shamed a schoolboy, figures scratched every which way and half of them wrong, and she asked could she set them straight, and I, who hated the books worse than any chore on the place, near wept with gratitude. So she kept my books, and she had a head for figures like I've never seen before or since. And come the fall, when I sold off the culls and some wool, and sent a wagon into Pike's to lay in winter supplies. Adeline went along to do the buying, since she was doing the accounts. She came back that night with her mouth set in a line I'd learned to read. "Mr. Barrett," she said, "your Mr. Pike is a thief." "Half the county says so," I said. "Nobody's proved it." "I can prove it," she said. "I bought 100 weight of flour today, and I bought 50 pounds of coffee and a keg of nails, and I weighed each of them myself when I got them home, on your feed scale, which I checked this morning against the test weights in your barn, and which is true. The flour is 92 pounds. The coffee is 46. He shorted me 8 pounds on the one and 4 on the other, and he charged me for 150. And when I sold your wool, I stood and watched him weigh it, and I'd weighed it myself that morning at 410 pounds, and his scale called it 378. 32 pounds gone into thin air. He robbed you coming and going, Mr. Barrett. 32 pounds on the wool and 12 on the flour and coffee, and he did it smiling. I sat down slow. You weighed it all yourself beforehand. I weigh everything, she said. I've kept house on nothing for 10 years. A woman who keeps house on nothing learns the weight of things or she starves. I knew the minute his scale spoke that it was lying, because I already knew the truth of what was on it. But knowing and proving are two things, so I brought it all home and weighed it careful and wrote it down. And she laid her ledger open on my table, and there it was in her fine clean hand, 2 columns, the true weight and Pike's weight, and the gap between them running all one way, exactly as folks had grumbled for years, only now it was written down and witnessed and true. He does this to everybody, I said. He does it to everybody who can't haul to the railhead, she said, which is every small holder in this county. I did the figuring on the ride home, Mr. Barrett. If he shaves them the way he shaved us, and he sells to how many families, 40, 50, he's stealing hundreds of dollars a season off people who haven't got hundreds of dollars to lose. There are families going hungry this winter so that man can have an oiled head and turn away brides at the depot. And they can't fight it, because it's his scale and his word against theirs, and who's the county going to believe? The merchant or the dirt poor yokums? I looked at that ledger a long time. They'll believe the ledger, I said, if it's laid out plain, if it's got the true weights beside his taken careful so any man can check the figures for himself. You've done that. I've done that, she said. Then we'll lay it out plain, I said. But not quiet, Adeline. Not a word in a corner that Pike can smother. It's got to be where the whole county sees it at once, so he can't buy off one man or lean on another. It's got to be public. And she looked at me and she said, slow, the harvest dance is Saturday. Now I have to tell you about the harvest dance, and about how I hadn't been to one in 4 years, and about what it cost me to go. The harvest dance at the Grange Hall was the biggest doings of the year in Cades Crossing. Everybody came, every family for 40 miles, the ranchers and the small holders and the town folk, all of them. The one night of the year the whole scattered county was under one roof. There was fiddle music, and there was a supper laid out on long boards, and there was dancing till near dawn. And it was, for a lonesome country, the closest thing we had to a holiday. Marion had loved it. Marion had made me dance every year of our marriage, and I danced like a fence post, but she made me do it anyway, laughing at me. And the last dance we ever danced was at that Grange Hall the fall before the fever took her, and I hadn't set foot in the place since. When the harvest dance came around, I sent the hands in to enjoy it, and I stayed home in the dark with a bottle I mostly didn't touch, and folks understood, and after the first year or two they stopped even asking. So when I said we'd lay Pike open at the harvest dance, I was saying I'd go, and Adeline, who missed nothing, looked at me and said quiet, "You don't go to the dance. Widow Dell told me, not since your wife." "No," I said. "Then don't go on my account," she said. "I can lay the ledger out myself. I'm not afraid of Harlan Pike or a hall full of strangers. You needn't put yourself through it." And I thought about that. I thought about the Grange Hall full of light and fiddle music, and every soul I'd been hiding from for 4 years. I thought about walking in there where Marion and I had danced our last dance and standing in that light. And then I thought about Adeline Shaw walking in there alone to face down the man who'd shamed her in front of that same crowd a month before, carrying a ledger that could get her called a liar or worse by every friend Pike had, and doing it by herself because the one man who'd promised to see her treated fair had stayed home in the dark hugging his grief. "No," I said, "I'll go. This is mine to do alongside you." And I stopped and made myself say the rest because it was true and she'd earned the truth. And it's past time I stopped hiding, Adeline. I've been dead 4 years alongside Marion and it's done nobody any good, least of all her. She'd be ashamed of me if she saw. She'd take a broom to me. I'll go. Adeline looked at me, and she said, gentle, "Then I'll be glad of the company." I want to tell it the way it was. Saturday came clear and cool, the first real bite of fall in the air, and I put on the good black coat I hadn't worn since Marion's funeral, which was a grim thought, and I put it aside. Reuben drove the wagon, and Adeline sat up on the seat in a dress Widow Dell had helped her make over, still plain, still gray-blue, but fresh. With a bit of lace at the collar she'd tatted herself in the evenings, and she had the ledger wrapped in oilcloth on her lap, and she held it the whole way like it was something that might try to get loose. The Grange Hall was already full and bright when we got there. Lanterns hung all round and the fiddles going and the long boards groaning with supper, and I stood in the doorway and it hit me like a horse's kick, all of it, the light and the noise and the memory. I near turned around. I'll admit that. I stood in that doorway and every part of me wanted to go back out into the dark where it was safe, and I felt Adeline's hand come to rest light on my arm just for a second, and she said low, only for me, "One thing at a time, Mr. Barrett. Just come in the door. That's all. Just the door." And I came in the door. The talk didn't stop the way it does in stories. It just kind of thinned and turned, folks nudging each other, and I heard my own name go around the room in a whisper, "Barrett. That's Jonah Barrett out at last, 4 years. And then I heard the other name go around right behind it, colder, and that's her, the one Pike sent back, the bride nobody. And I saw the looks turn on Adeline, some of them curious and some of them unkind. And I saw a couple of the town women put their heads together and laugh behind their hands the way they'd laughed on the platform. And Harlan Pike was there, of course, holding court by the punch with a knot of his friends, oiled and grand, and he saw us come in, and his face did an ugly thing. He hadn't expected to see either of us, me because I never came, her because he figured he'd run her off for good, and to see us walk in together struck him wrong. I could tell, though he didn't yet know why. I got Adeline a cup of punch, and I got myself one, and we stood at the edge of it, and I let the room look its fill. And I found, standing there, that the thing I'd dreaded for 4 years wasn't as big as the dread had made it. It was just a room full of people I knew. The Yocums came and shook my hand, glad to see me. Old Micah Stone gripped my shoulder and said it was good, and his eyes were wet, and I understood he meant it was good I'd come back to the living. Reuben and the hands drifted in and stood easy nearby. It was just my county, my people, and they were glad to see me, most of them, and the shame I'd carried about hiding turned out to be mine alone. They'd only ever felt for me and been waiting. But I hadn't come for that, or not only. When the fiddles paused between sets, I stepped up onto the little platform at the end where the caller stood, and I raised my hand, and the room quieted because a man who hasn't spoken in public in 4 years stepping up to speak is a thing that quiets a room. "Most of you know me," I said. "Jonah Barrett. I've been a poor neighbor these 4 years, and I mean to do better starting tonight, but that's not what I got up here to say." I looked out at them, all those faces, and I found Pikes in the crowd, gone wary now. I got up here to say a thing about our weights and measures, about the scale most of you sell your wool on and buy your flour on because it's the only scale in 40 miles. There's been talk for years that it doesn't weigh true. I never gave it much mind because I haul my own to the railhead. That was selfish of me. It was talk that touched every small family in this county, and I let it stay talk because it didn't touch me. I'm ashamed of that too. The room had gone dead quiet. Pike started forward, his face working, but old Micah Stone and one of the Yoakum boys had drifted, without any word said, to stand in his way, easy, just standing, and Pike stopped. "There's a woman here," I said, "that most of you know only as the one Harlan Pike turned away at the depot last month and let the town laugh at. Adeline Shaw. She's worked my kitchen and doctored my hands and kept my books since, and I'll tell you plain she's the best of all three that this county's ever seen, and Pike's the fool that let her go. But that's not why I named her. I named her because she did what none of us men had the wit or the will to do in 10 years of grumbling. She weighed it. Every pound at home, on a true scale, the true weight beside Pike's weight, wrote down careful in a ledger any man here can check for himself. Adeline. And Adeline Shaw walked up onto that platform in her made-over dress with her lace collar, in front of the whole county that had laughed at her, and she was not afraid, and she opened her ledger. "I'll not make speeches," she said in that plain carrying voice. "I'll read you figures, and any man that doubts them can bring his own goods to Mr. Barrett's barn Monday morning, where there's test weights sealed true, and weigh for himself. On the 9th of this month I bought at Mr. Pike's store 100 weight of flour. It weighed true 92 pounds. He charged for 100. I bought 50 pounds of coffee. It weighed 46. He charged for 50. The same day I sold 410 pounds of wool, weighed true that morning. Mr. Pike's scale called it 378, 32 pounds gone." She turned a page. "Micah Stone. On the 2nd you sold Pike 200 pounds of wool by his scale. If his scale shorts the way it shorted me, a little over 7 in the 100, he took near 15 pounds off you and never paid it. Yoakum, Devereaux, I've reckoned it for every sale I could learn of this season." She looked up. "It runs all one way. It always runs all one way. An honest scale is wrong as often high as low. His is only ever wrong in his own favor. That is not a broken scale, gentlemen. That is a thief's scale. You never heard a room go the way that room went. It went from quiet to a low, ugly rumble, and it was all pointed one direction, and Harlan Pike stood in the middle of it with his oiled head and felt the whole county turn on him at once. He blustered. He said she was a liar, a spiteful woman he'd rightly turned away, out to ruin him for revenge. But it wouldn't hold because she hadn't said one spiteful word. She'd read figures, cold figures, and offered every man there the means to check them himself Monday morning, and a liar doesn't do that. A liar doesn't invite you to weigh it yourself. And old Micah Stone said, loud into the rumble, "I'll be at Barrett's barn Monday with my scale book, Harlan, and we'll just see." And a dozen other men said the same, and Pike saw the whole rotten structure of 10 years' cheating come down in the space of 5 minutes, brought down by the woman he'd turned away as worthless. He left. There wasn't much else he could do. He went out into the dark with a couple of his friends, the fewer than he'd come with, and the Grange Hall let out a long breath behind him. And then, I remember this, somebody started to clap, and then the whole hall was clapping, and it was for Adeline, standing up there on the platform with her ledger, the bride nobody wanted, who had just handed the county back its stolen honesty. She came down off the platform into all that noise looking a little stunned by it, and the women who'd laughed behind their hands weren't laughing now. They were crowding to shake her hand, and I stood back and let her have it, that turning, that setting right, because she'd earned every clap of it herself, and I'd not take a hair of it from her. That should have been the end of it. The story could stop there and be a good one, the cheat exposed, the scorned woman vindicated, the county set right. But it isn't the end, because there was still a dance to dance, and it was the dance, not the ledger, that folks tell about most, and I'd best tell it true. The fiddles started up again after a while, once the excitement had settled, and the caller called a two-step, and the couples went out onto the floor, the way they do. And Adeline Shaw stood at the edge of the crowd where I'd left her, and I watched the thing happen that I should have seen coming and didn't. Nobody asked her to dance. She'd been vindicated, cheered, thanked. But she was still the bride Pike had sent back, still a stranger, still a plain woman of 30 in a made-over dress. And the young men wanted the young girls and the married men had their wives. And one by one the couples went out onto the floor and Adeline Shaw stood at the edge of it, alone, watching. And I saw her face. She'd stood on that platform and read down a thief without a flicker, but standing at the edge of a dance floor with nobody crossing to her. That got in past her guard, just for a second before she smoothed it down. Because a woman can be brave and still want, somewhere under the brave, to be chosen. To be the one somebody crosses a floor for. She'd come 2,000 miles hoping to be of use and to be treated fair, and she'd got both. But nobody had come 2,000 inches to say she was wanted. And I saw, in that one unguarded second, how much that lack had weighed on her, all her life, heavier than any of Pike's short pounds. And I stood there at the edge of that Grange Hall where I hadn't danced in 4 years, where I'd danced my last with Marion, and I was scared. I'll tell it plain. I was scared the way I'd been scared in the doorway more. Because to cross that floor was to say a thing out loud, to her and to the whole county, that I hadn't rightly said even to myself. It was to stop being Marion's widower and start being something else, something new, and I didn't know if I had the right, or the courage, or if Marion, but there. That was the grief talking, the 4 years of dark, and I heard, clear as if she'd said it, what Adeline had told me weeks before at my own table. She'd be ashamed of you if she saw. Marion would have taken a broom to me. Marion, who made me dance every year though I danced like a fence post, who'd have crossed that floor herself and put my hand in Adeline's if she could, laughing at me the whole time. So I crossed the floor. I crossed the whole length of that Grange Hall in my funeral coat, dancing like a fence post the whole way in my heart, with the whole county watching a man who hadn't danced in 4 years walk out into the light. And I came to where Adeline Shaw stood alone at the edge, and I took my hat off. I'd left it on, standing there, and I took it off and I said, loud enough for the near ones to hear, because I wanted it heard. Miss Shaw, I'm a poor hand at this, and I've not done it in a long while, and I'll likely tread on your feet. But I'd be proud past saying if you dance this one with me. And Adeline Shaw looked at me a long moment, and her gray eyes went bright, and she did not smooth it down this time. She let it show, and she put her hand in mine and said, I'd be glad to, Mr. Barrett, I'd be glad to. And we danced. I did tread on her feet, twice, and she laughed and I laughed, and we went round that floor slow and clumsy, the two of us, and I felt the whole county watching, and for once in 4 years I did not care what anybody watching thought, because the woman in my arms was worth the whole hall and everybody in it, and I'd just been fool enough and brave enough, both at once, to say so with my feet. And somewhere in the turning of that dance, the thing that had been growing quiet and slow all through the harvest, over the account books and the kitchen table and the long true talks in the evenings, came up plain into the light where I could finally see it and name it. And I stopped, right there in the middle of the floor, with the fiddles going and the couples going round us, and I said, Adeline, I don't want you to earn your passage back east. I want you to stay. Not as my cook and not as my bookkeeper, though heaven knows you're better than any wage I could pay. I want you to stay as my wife, if you'll have a slow, grief-broke old rancher who dances like a fence post. I've been half alive 4 years and you've woke the other half, and I don't want to go back to sleep. I'm asking you honest and I'm asking you free. You can say no and keep the job and your terms in writing, and I'll not say another word about it ever. But I had to ask. And she stood there in the middle of that floor with me, and the fiddles came to the end of the tune, and in the little quiet before the next one somebody near enough heard, and the word went out through the hall in a rush, and the whole Grange Hall went still and turned to look, the way it had turned for Pike, only warm this time, waiting. And Adeline Shaw looked up at me, the bride 2,000 miles from home that a whole town had watched turned away as worthless. And she said, so the near ones heard, and then the whole hall heard. Yes, yes, Jonah, I'll stay, and I'll marry you. Not because I've nowhere else I could go, I've the wage saved, you made sure of that, and that's the very thing that lets me choose you free and mean it. I choose you. I've been of use and I've been treated fair, and it was more than I hoped for. But you just crossed a whole room in front of God and everybody for a woman a town threw away, and no soul's ever crossed a room for me in my whole life. So yes, I'll have you feet and all. And the Grange Hall came down. Old Micah Stone was hollering, and Reuben had his hat in the air, and Widow Dell was crying into her handkerchief, and the fiddles struck up something wild and glad, and the county of Cade's Crossing, that had watched Harlan Pike turn Adeline Shaw away as spoiled goods not 2 months before, cheered fit to lift the roof off as I kissed her once, chaste and quick, in front of all of them, my hat clutched forgotten in my hand. We were married 3 weeks later in that same Grange Hall, because it wouldn't hold everybody who wanted to come, and we crammed them in anyway. Micah Stone gave the bride away, having appointed himself, there being no family within 2,000 miles, and half the county turned out and the other half was jealous. And Harlan Pike wasn't there. Harlan Pike, having sold his store at a loss that winter and left the country ahead of the reckoning, once Monday's weighing at my barn proved Adeline's ledger true to the pound. And a new man came and set up honest scales, and the small holders of that county got a fair count for their labor for the first time in 10 years, and they had Adeline Shaw to thank for it, and they knew it, and they never forgot it. We had 41 years. I'll not tell all of it. A marriage is its own country, and most of it belongs to the two who lived it, but I'll tell you it was good. It was good all the way to the bone, the kind of love she'd said I'd had with Marion. And I'll tell you a strange, gentle thing, that having loved Marion all the way to the bone was what let me love Adeline the same, that the one grief had dug the well deep enough to hold the second joy. And Adeline never once minded that I kept Marion's grave tended up on the rise, but tended it alongside me, and taught our children to lay flowers there for the first wife they never knew, and when Adeline's own time came. Near 40 years on, she asked to be laid up on that rise too, all 3 of us together, and that is where we'll all be, come my own turn, which by the ache in these hands can't be so far off now. We had 4 children that lived, and 2 we buried small, and Adeline doctored half the county for 40 years, and kept books straight for anybody that asked, and never let a scale in Cade's Crossing weigh crooked again as long as she drew breath. And every harvest, every single year, we went to the dance at the Grange Hall, and every single year, no matter my aching knees, no matter how old and slow and finspost clumsy I got, I crossed that floor and asked my wife to dance out loud so the young folks could hear how it was done. Miss Shaw, I'd be proud past saying if you'd dance this one with me. And every year she put her hand in mine and said, I'd be glad to, Jonah. I'd be glad to. And we'd go round that floor slow, the 2 old fools, while our children and then our grandchildren watched, and I'd tread on her feet on purpose by then to hear her laugh. I've told my grandchildren this story so many times they can say the parts along with me. And the youngest one, my little Marion, for we named a daughter Marion, Adeline's own notion, and that girl named her own. She asked me once, sitting on my knee, why I crossed the whole floor that night when I was so scared, when I could have just stayed safe at the edge. And I told her the truest thing I know, which is this, that the safe edge of the floor is a lonesome place, and a body can stand there so long grieving what's lost that it forgets there's living yet to do. That every good thing in a long life costs a walk across a floor you're afraid to cross, in front of people you're afraid will laugh. That the woman standing alone at the edge, the one nobody's crossing to, the one a town's thrown away, she is like as not the finest soul in the whole hall, and worth 10 of the ones being crossed to, if a man's only got the eyes to see it and the nerve in his boots to walk. And I told her that her grandmother Adeline came 2,000 miles hoping only to be of use and to be treated fair, and never once dared hope to be chosen, to be wanted, to be the one somebody crossed a room for, and that the one right thing I did in a long life of middling ones was to cross that room, and that it was the best walk I ever took, and I'd take it again this minute, aching knees and all, If the good Lord and my Adeline would only let me hear those fiddles one more time.